Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, State Strategies to Combat Human Trafficking on Public Transit. I am Mary Wirtz, and I am a policy associate here at the Council of State Governments. Before we get started with today's presentation, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Next slide. You have been automatically muted as part of today's webinar, but if you have questions for either of our speakers, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Once we've heard from both of our speakers, we will go through and answer any questions you may have at the end. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please feel free to drop a comment in the chat as well, and someone from the CSG team will be in touch to help you out. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the PowerPoint slides will be shared with you and anyone else who is registered for this event later this week. Next slide. All right. Today's webinar will be reviewing the brand new report published by the Council of State Governments titled Safety Awareness on Public Transit, State Responses. The report was developed in partnership with the Federal Transit Administration and outlines different strategies that states have adopted to combat the use of public transit in human trafficking. While human trafficking does not require movement or transportation of an individual, we know that many perpetrators rely on public transportation for the recruitment, moving, and controlling of victims and delivering victims to buyers. The content of this report draws directly from the multi-day virtual learning summit that CSG hosted with policymakers and other key stakeholders to explore possible solutions to this issue. To discuss the report, we are pleased to welcome Kristen Joyner of the Community Transportation Association of America and CSG's own Sydney Blodgett. Next slide. First, I would like to introduce Kristen Joyner. Kristen is the Vice President of the Community Transportation Association of America, a national membership association representing rural, small urban, specialized, and non-emergency medical transportation providers nationwide. Kristen has represented the Southwest Transit Association on the CTAA board since 2017. Currently, she serves as an advocate for transit issues and conducts leadership training and certification programs for transportation professionals. From 2012 to 2016, she was a member of the White House Task Force for Transit Leaders. Recently, she spearheaded Operation Veterans in Public Transportation, a project to acknowledge and support veterans in transportation. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Kristen Joyner.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this, this unveiling of a wonderful report. If we can bring up the first slide, that'd be great. I've been working in this area of education on human trafficking for about 10 years now, and learned early on that there is an intersection, a very clear intersection between human trafficking and public transportation. Then it bore itself out in a research project done by Polaris that interviewed survivors of human trafficking. 42% of those survivors stated that buses were used in their facilitation and exploitation. And then 26% of those same folks said that public transit played a role in at least one exit attempt. So my goal here in about the first 10, 15 minutes or so is to talk about human trafficking and its relationship to transit, and really transit's role and responsibility. I always like to start with my mantra, and I'm going to say my mantra and then I'm going to give it to you. I know that we're in a virtual forum, but when I do this in person, I usually have everybody stand up and I'll say the mantra and then you repeat after me. So you can sit in the comfort of your own office or home or car, wherever you are viewing this, but I do want you to participate in this mantra. So it's not on my bus, not on my train, not in my community. Okay, so you guys are probably thinking, well, that's kind of goofy for us to repeat, but I do want you to do it one more time, okay? And I want you to do it with gusto and really feel a part of this community of transportation professionals who are trying hard to do their part in eradicating human trafficking. So here it is again, not on my bus, not on my train, not in my community. All right, very good. Thank you for participating in that if you did. Next slide, please. So we have found through a lot of interactions with survivor-informed conversations, with research, that there really are 4 key areas to success. Those are having protocols in place, having a policy, doing the right kind of training, and having partnerships. So what I have found is that people already see this thing called human trafficking, but they just don't know what to call it. I provided training for over 200 frontline employees in North Carolina, and I involved victims advocate organizations. One of them in particular talks specifically about trafficking incidents at the transfer center in this particular area. They work with 12 to 18-year-old girls who have been trafficked. And what they found and what they reported to these frontline bus operators, bus drivers, was that the 12 to 18-year-olds, they actually called this transfer center the pit of hell, because it's where they met their traffickers and were trafficked from one route to another. The employees in this training meeting, they agreed that they had seen it, but they didn't really know what to do about it. They felt helpless. So after the training, the employees discovered that they could call or text the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I put the number up on the screen. It's real easy to remember, especially if you think about it the way that it's written, 888-3737-888. You can put that in your cell phone and mark it as the human trafficking hotline number, and always have it at your fingertips. I actually have used that number twice for 2 significant reportings of human trafficking. And I did it, it was both times, it was text-based. So it was real easy to text the information and get a conversation started. That number is answered 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But it is a way for people to report, and then law enforcement and local service providers to get involved and figure out, is this really human trafficking and who needs help? And another thing as it relates to how people see it is the portrayal. We want to make sure that there are accurate portrayals. Many times we see trafficking through the lens of a movie like Taken. And honestly, that's not truly what happens in most cases. The use of local resources, and there's an organization called A21 that has several videos that highlight what does it look like for someone to be drawn into sex trafficking, labor trafficking, or domestic servitude. And those are the 3 main areas of human trafficking. So sex trafficking, labor trafficking, and domestic servitude. And on the screen, you actually see examples of all of those. I do want to point out the middle picture with the tattoo. There's only one thing that we brand typically in the United States, and that's cattle. And in the trafficking industry, branding with tattoos and other means is a form of ownership and dehumanization. This particular tattoo is one that's a barcode. So this person is dehumanized down to a bar of soap that you might run across a scanner at Walmart. And this barcode has the ability to not only let the trafficker know that she has made it to her destination, but it also is a way of payment for the person buying the services. So dehumanization is definitely a part of this. Partnerships have to be forged in every community, whether you live in urban, rural, tribal community, and it does need to include transit, law enforcement, service providers, and really anyone willing to stand up and say, not on my bus, not on my train, not in my community. The next thing that people are looking for, they're asking, is this true? Does this really happen in my community? Well, I'm going to tell you about Oklahoma City Embark. Embark is the transit system for the Oklahoma City area. Employees, they work to protect a victim and got her to the needed services. So I'm going to tell their story just a little bit. Embark has a grant-supported program called Climb. And the focus is on parents who were incarcerated and newly released from prison. Many of you on this call know how hard it is for reunification to take place with children. And this grant and this program asked the question, if transit or transportation was not a barrier, would reunification be more successful? So through that program, the entire organization at Embark, but particularly the frontline employees, were provided webinars on empathy training. So that was sort of the foundation for the story that I'm going to tell you. The second thing that Embark committed to was training all of the employees on human trafficking awareness. And they use the Busing on the Lookout materials. It's also known as BOTL, B-O-T-L. And that is going to be referenced in the report that you'll see or later on. So so first of all, there was empathy training. Second, there was human trafficking awareness training. And a bus driver on his route realized that there was someone on the vehicle that was not acting quite right. And the other riders were saying, oh, this person's crazy. He got that rider's attention and said, why don't you sit right behind me? Let's get to the end of this route. And then maybe I can help you. So that's what the person did. They sat right behind the driver. In the meantime, the driver, because of protocol, because remember, protocol is a big part of this, having the right protocol. The protocol was that this operator needed to call dispatch and let them know what was going on. A supervisor was called and they met the bus at the transfer center. So the person then, the supervisor talked to her, a manager came on and talked to her, and indeed she said that she needed help. She self-identified, I need help, and this is what's been happening to me over the last several months. And it sounded like human trafficking. Now, most people will not walk up to your bus operator or walk up to the folks doing cleaning at a roadside park or a state park and say, I'm being trafficked. That usually doesn't happen. But in this situation, because there was empathy training and the right questions were asked, this person shared their information. So the next thing that happened, because they had a protocol, because they had a policy, and because the person said, I think I'm being followed, they were able to use some jackets and they escorted the person into the building at the transfer center, got the person into a safe space, called local law enforcement, called some survivor folks who were helping in the area that they already had identified. And they got this person the help that they needed. The passenger was identified correctly as a human trafficking victim/survivor, and Truckers Against Trafficking awarded the driver, the supervisor, and the manager with their highest award called the Harriet Tubman Award. This just happened in May. And just an awesome example of how if you have good protocol, policy, training, and partnerships, you really can make a difference. I got involved in this journey as a result of Dallas Area Rapid Transit when a single board member who saw a presentation at an APTA meeting said, we need this at DART. And the board said this doesn't just need to be for frontline employees, but it needs to be for the entire organization, including the board. And at this point in time, over 3,000 employees have been completely trained on human trafficking awareness. They have several programs at DART, and that training hasn't occurred once, but twice since they started their successful programming. You want to make sure that you use accurate data, and that a place to find that data is Polaris and the the National Hotline for Human Trafficking. You want to connect with survivors organizations, because your information needs to be survivor informed. It doesn't need to come, like I said, from movies or from what a neighbor tells you, but there are ways to get true, accurate data, true, accurate information, so that you are portraying this in the right way. And then finally, on this particular point, I have had the privilege of working with missing and murdered Indigenous women, and have partnered with National RTAP on programming to help not only tribes, but rural and small urban agencies to understand this issue. Native women are trafficked at a higher rate per capita than any other group. It's because they are thought of as what's called exotics. I did speak to an FBI undercover agent who works particularly in indigenous areas of the US on this issue, and she confirmed that they're treated quite differently. And they are trafficked for both sex trade and labor trafficking. Finally, there was an article that has just recently come out from Transportation Research Board. It's their April-May edition of TR News. It has an excellent cover article on human trafficking and Indigenous women. Margot Hill authored that. And then I've written a sidebar article on practical ways that the transportation industry can help with this issue. So we've already talked about people already see it, they don't know what to call it. We've talked about people are asking, is this true? And is it happening in their community? Now I want to talk about people want to know what to do when they see it. We've already talked about the one issue, the one situation in Oklahoma City, but Prairie Hills Transit in Spearfish, South Dakota. You wouldn't imagine on a typical day that they would see something that looks like human trafficking. But they brought in trainers, had their whole staff trained on human trafficking. And because of that, and by the way, that was a partnership with the South Dakota DOT and North Dakota DOT and North Dakota transit agencies. It was a big two-state effort. They involved law enforcement and local victim agencies in the training. One of the employees, several weeks after the training, noticed unusual ticket sales that were to one person, but it was in the names of multiple people for multiple destinations. They have a Greyhound terminal there. They were using lots of different credit cards when they were making these ticket purchases. So the employee listened to her gut and asked, could this be human trafficking? So the director called me and I got her in touch with the right sector of law enforcement. It has been turned over to the FBI and Homeland Security and is part of an active investigation. Just remember that phone number is key in the training. And Bottle Busing on the Lookout has a little pocket card that any transit employee or transportation professional can keep right with them, that has that number and also has good tips for reporting and also things to look out for. I think we'll go to our next slide. I do want to point out that there are 5 training resources that are coming out later this year that are easy to use and are provided through an FTA grant called the Interactive Learning Resources and Guidance for Improving Crime Prevention and Public Safety for the Public and Transit Employees. That's a very long name for the fact that you're going to have some tools to work with that are new tools that help with crime prevention and public safety. And it's a joint venture of Texas Transit Institute, Community Transportation Association of America, and Southwest Transit Association. So this page that you're looking for here is actually referenced in the report that Sydney is going to be talking about here in just a few minutes. The Advisory Council on Human Trafficking was established in 2018 as required by the Combating Human Trafficking and Commercial Vehicle Act. Its 15 members were asked to provide recommendations to the U.S. Department of Transportation members that identify and address successful counter-trafficking strategies, best practices, data collection, information sharing technology, and legislative and administrative changes. And I think that's highlighted on the screen because that's where you fit in, this group that this report is going back to, the legislative and administrative changes. So in the report, and I've noted it here on this slide, that pages 7-34 is information for state departments of transportation, 7-36 is states licensing agencies, and 7-64 state human trafficking laws intersecting with transportation. Those are all really good pages to pinpoint and look at as you're doing the research for your particular organization. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sydney so that she can tell you about this great report. And don't forget, not on my bus, not on my train, not in my community.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kristen, for our opening presentation. So many good things in your remarks there. I'll personally always remember that it's not like Taken in real life, and lucky for that. Next, I'd like to welcome Ms. Sydney Blodgett. Sydney Blodgett is a project manager at the Council of State Governments. Sydney has experience in engaging state leaders to discuss policy issues and solutions in a bipartisan and innovative way. Throughout her career, she has researched and analyzed state-level policies in a variety of areas, including education, workforce development, and transportation. Prior to CSG, Sydney worked for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. She earned a Bachelor's of Arts from the University of Louisville and her MPA from the University of Kentucky. Please help me welcome Sydney Blodgett.
Thank you so much, Mary. And thank you so much, Kristen, for setting the stage. And we're just so honored to have the partnership that we do with CTAA and our work in this area, and excited to be here with you all today. Thank you all so much for joining. A little bit of background, and I know Mary mentioned this at the beginning, is that CSG was awarded a grant from the Federal Transit Administration to really gather stakeholders, gather people to the table to talk about what can states do in response to human trafficking on public transit. How can we make sure that our transit systems are safe and accessible for all, and how can we train people to be aware that this is happening? And so there are a lot of different steps in that, some of which Kristen already spoke to, but I'm going to walk through the report that was developed out of that 2-day learning seminar back in November and walk through some of those action steps that states can take. And we'll have Mary put a link to the report in the chat, and we'll walk through it today, but happy to share that and follow up with anyone regarding the report. So if we can go on to the next slide. So this is something that you've heard already today, but transportation, unfortunately, is a place where human traffickers look for, they might look for their victims for recruitment. Maybe their individuals are traveling, or maybe they're homeless hanging out at a train station. Maybe it's to move them or control them, get them to the next spot. or delivering victims to buyers who have been a part of that exploitation. So there's a lot of different ways where transportation intersects with the process of human trafficking. And, Kristen already mentioned Polaris, which is another great partner, great organization in this space. And some of their research identified that 63% of respondents of survivors said that they utilized some combination of mass transit, whether it be buses, subways, any other publicly accessible transportation services, taxis, ride sharing, Lyft, Uber, during the time that they were being trafficked. So you can see how this intersection is very strong and how the transportation industry can have such an impact in the fight against human trafficking. So we can go on to the next slide. We can kind of walk through some of these main policy considerations. So out of this event that we had, there were, okay, what are the different things that states can do? And we kind of came to these 4 main buckets, and I'll walk through each of these 4 items today. One of which is raising awareness of trafficking on public transit, engaging key stakeholders, getting the right people at the table. Also considering the special populations affected. You already heard Kristen talk about, missing and murdered Indigenous women and kind of how the Indigenous population is pulled into this. We'll talk about some more populations there. And then also considering transit safety options more broadly. So not even just focusing on human trafficking, but how can making transportation safer more broadly also impact human trafficking? So we'll go ahead and dive right in. If we can go on to the next slide, looking at consideration number 1. So this is raising awareness of human trafficking on public transit. I'm sure a lot of but there's a lot of myths still out there of, oh, this only happens in New York City or in LA or, in these big transit hubs. And as you heard already from Kristen, an example in South Dakota, an example in Oklahoma. So human trafficking can happen anywhere, and it is happening in all 50 states, unfortunately. And so kind of, busting those myths. And Polaris has some really great resources as well on, breaking through those myths of human trafficking, or, maybe it only happens to young, skinny blondes, or, some of these misconceptions that we have in our head, that might not be true. So how do we raise awareness of who this is impacting, where it's happening? And there's a couple different ways that we shared on this. First is training transit employees. So looking at, what kind of trainings are out there? Is this a requirement? Some states have made, if you want to get your CDL, you have to do a training on this, or different things like that. How are we making sure that people within the industry are aware? Also looking at expanded information sharing. So whether that's signs, social media, those little note cards that Kristen mentioned, what are the different ways that we can share these resources out in the communities to help people become aware? Maybe it's signs on the back of a bathroom stall at a truck stop or at a bus stop, different things like that we're seeing of how we can spread this information. So we can go on to the next slide. I'd like to give a couple of state highlights. Also want to mention just sharing that human trafficking hotline number as well is a great tool, and just making that a well-known number. So first wanted to talk about some state examples regarding training and some different examples we've seen in California and Texas. California actually passed legislation requiring transit agencies to develop human trafficking awareness training for all new and existing employees. So it is now a legal responsibility of transit agencies to train their employees in this. Similarly, in Dallas, Texas, the Dallas Area Rapid Transit, or DART system, trained police officers, their fare enforcement officers, and their bus and rail operators on the warning signs of human trafficking, as well as the best way to report these indicators. So not only looking at just their transit employees, but also what about the people there to to check for fares, or the people that are there just for regular safety, and the police officers and other security officers that are there. And then last, I wanted to mention the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority, the BTA there, and their light rail system. They actually partnered with the County of Santa Clara's Office of Women's Policy to actually train over 700 bus drivers and maintenance personnel on recognizing the warning signs. So again, going beyond just the people within that direct content, but the other surrounding employees as well. Over 2,000 employees have received training through this program, looking at, the warning signs and what to do if you think someone might be a victim. We can go on to the next slide, looking at, how are we sharing resources? And this can look a lot of different ways. The state of Iowa, their Department of Transportation actually has a map of victim services available on its website. So if you go to their DOT website, this is a key thing there. So whether you're, a vendor or a staff, or just, a constituent, a citizen of Iowa, looking at there, they have them broadly and easily accessible on the state site. The LA Metro launched a Don't Be Silent campaign. So this was a huge campaign across the city. There were 3,000 ads placed on buses, rail cars, and over 85,000 brochures with resources of how victims of human trafficking can find services. So these were put in customer centers, stations, buses, trains, public restrooms, you name it. This campaign was everywhere. And it was, very similar to that. See something, say something. Don't be silent. If you see something that doesn't sound right, it's very possible that something could be going on there. And so you see in the picture on this slide, some of the LA Metro staff launching that campaign, and it was very successful and caught a lot of attention. It got some national media attention. And so just, putting it out there and getting that conversation started, and how big that was. I encourage you, if you're thinking, we want to share resources in our state, but we don't know, I don't know if we have the capacity to develop our own resources. There is stuff out there. We've mentioned Polaris a number of times. They were actually a part of this 2-day learning seminar, and they have a plethora of resources on their website that, are open and free to download and share and post within your state. So I definitely recommend checking out some of their resources, and their website is linked in the report that Mary shared as well. So if we can go on to the next slide, the next topic that I want to talk about is engaging key stakeholders. So we've talked about, how transportation plays a key role in that, but who in transportation, who in this state? And human trafficking, it's not a siloed issue. It crosses a lot of different paths, a lot of different agencies, and countless stakeholders must be involved in these efforts to really make a difference. And cross-agency collaboration is key to evaluate current policies, establish new policies, practices. I was excited to see that, we have members of the legislature here. So not only do we need that agency buy-in, but the buy-in of the legislature. I've already talked about a couple of different pieces of legislation that have been passed, and the impact that those have had. So there's a couple of different ways that we've seen, states trying to create a way to get all the right people at the table. So one of which being, a task force, a state task force on this issue. Others being a designated staff position. So someone whose job it is within state government to focus on human trafficking within the state and to coordinate with all the different stakeholders and people that need to be at the table. So kind of that one coordinator person. I have this stat on here because I thought it was really impressive, and it was reassuring to see that at least 26 states have enacted legislation that creates a human trafficking task force, work group, study group. We can call it a million different things, but to develop a group of designated people to come together and look at this effort. So if we can go on to the next slide, I'd be happy to talk. If we can go one more, and then we'll go back to the last one. Yes, so looking at, who are these people that we need at the table? And so during the meeting, we, kind of brainstormed and just spitballed different ideas. Who really makes a difference in this? Who do you need at the table? So I'll walk through some of these and note that this list is not exhaustive. This is just a place to start. So like I said, legislators, being able to get that policy change. Also judges. This is a huge issue within the judicial system. We actually had a state judge from Minnesota speak on our last event that was talking about, how often are you seeing these people, and the judges needing to realize when someone is a victim and how to provide them with services instead of, maybe criminalizing some of the coinciding things that were going on. But the root problem is that that person was being trafficked, especially at the juvenile level. So having judges involved, of course, having departments of transportation there, additional state leaders in all three branches of state government. Also looking at, truckers association and rental and landlord associations, looking at law enforcement. A lot of time these people are somehow crossing paths with law enforcement. So making sure that they're seeing those warning signs. Academia, researchers, nonprofit organizations, a lot of, organizations that serve victims. Also having survivors at the table to share their experiences. Also defense attorneys, probation officers, social workers. Kristen mentioned this earlier with the tattoos and the branding. Having tattoo parlors and artists at the table, they can pick up on a lot of those warning signs, and having people educated that are in that field will know when something like that's going on and can report it. Look at parks and recreation areas, medical providers, and also licensing boards such as massage therapy. So this is just a really good place to start. It's in the report. If you're looking at, okay, I want to develop a task force, I want to develop a group, who do I invite? Here's a great place to start. And I'm sure these people would have a list of 5 other people that should be at the table. So wanted to share this. Again, it's in the report too, but it's a really great place to start for stakeholders to include. And if we can go on to the next slide, I'd be happy to share a couple states and what they have done in this route. New Jersey actually developed a human trafficking coordinator position within the Office of the Attorney General. This coordinator, their role is to focus on, okay, we need to look at human trafficking within our state. How do we coordinate with victim services? How do we coordinate with survivors? How do we coordinate with law enforcement, with the transportation industry? So this one designated person to really lead that effort within the state, which can be monumental. Also, similarly, wanted to talk about Arkansas. They actually wrote it into their code to have a human trafficking task force. It included representatives from Office of the Attorney General, Office of the Governor, Department of Labor, Department of Health, Health and Human Services, Arkansas Association of Chief of Police, the Sheriff's Association, the State Police, the Prosecuting Attorneys Association, local law enforcement at a city level, non-governmental organizations, child services and runaway services, and then academic researchers. So you can see how they had this really broad group. And actually in the report, it's linked to, you can click on it, the outcomes and the findings that this group found and the recommendations that they gave to the governor and to the legislature for kind of next steps. How do we address this problem? What steps should the state take in this way? So that's a really great example of seeing how they formed this group and then what were the outcomes of this group. So definitely hat off to Arkansas for that. And that is linked in the report where you can read a little bit more about that. And if we go on to the next slide, want to start to talk about the third consideration. And this is considering the specific populations affected. And first, I found this definition of a victim very interesting. A victim is someone or something that has been hurt, damaged, killed, or has suffered because of the actions of someone or something else, or because of illness or chance. So this is just, anyone who's been impacted by human trafficking. So while human trafficking can happen to anyone, Certain populations can be more vulnerable to instances of coercion and control, and statistically, looking at victims have been disproportionately affected by human trafficking. So, I do want to acknowledge that anyone can be impacted by this, but there are certain populations that have been disproportionately affected by human trafficking. So I want to acknowledge that and think about how can we think about these specific populations whenever we're looking at, solving this issue and strategies to combat it. So if we can go on to the next slide. So these are what, this is actually a graphic that came directly from the Polaris project. So I want to give them credit where credit is due, but a list of people that they have found through their research that might be particularly vulnerable to trafficking. So maybe someone has an unstable living situation. They have a history of domestic violence. They have a caregiver or family giver who has a substance abuse disorder. Maybe they're an undocumented immigrant. They are a runaway or are involved in the juvenile justice system or the foster care system. They are facing poverty or economic need. They have a history of sexual abuse, or they are addicted to drugs or alcohol. And all of these factors that someone might face, and you have to realize people might be facing multiple of these factors that make someone more susceptible to fall into human trafficking, to be coerced into human trafficking. So these are populations that we really want to think about whenever we're looking at solving this issue. If these are the people that are most vulnerable to it, how do we serve and consider these populations during that? If we can go on to the next slide. So I did want to talk about a couple different things that states have done in this field, but I also just wanted to mention a couple other groups that were not mentioned on this slide, but are mentioned in the report and that have been disproportionately affected. I know that was not a comprehensive list on the last slide, and I know everyone that I mentioned will still won't be comprehensive, but also, people of color, people of the LGBTQ plus community have been, research has shown are more likely to be trafficked than other demographic groups, looking at, again, abuse, poverty. As Kristen mentioned earlier, Indigenous women and girls, and also children are also a more vulnerable group. So again, this is not comprehensive, but wanted to mention, a couple of these different populations that we really need to be considerate of. So looking at kind of how have states responded to this, looking at Dallas Area Rapid Transit, so the DART program, again, they work with Safe Place, which is a national youth outreach and prevention program for young people needing help and safety. So looking at that younger population, it extends the reach of local youth services, youth shelters, and organizations to help children that are in crisis situations, and creating networks of community access points where young people can seek assistance. So these might be foster care youth aging out of the foster care service, maybe youth that are experiencing, child abuse at home, or might be runaway youth. And so the transportation industry here works very closely with services that, that provide services and supports for these youth, so that there's that connection there. So if they know this is a vulnerable population, how do we connect with them and make sure that we're having that, cross training and cross awareness. Also looking for a program out of Pennsylvania, SEPTA's Hub of Hope in Philadelphia. It's a partnership between the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority, SEPTA, and the city of Philadelphia and Project Home. And so this is Project Home is an organization focusing on homeless individuals. And so how do we make sure that people that are homeless are not getting pulled into the human trafficking situation? And there are a lot of times where, whether it be a bus station, rail station, that a lot of homeless people might segregate there, might find shelter there. And so how do we connect with those agencies to make sure that those people aren't at risk of being, being trafficked because of the situation that they're in. So working with community partners that serve, youth, runaway youth, that might serve homeless or LGBT individuals, looking at how do we use these existing services to really make sure that we're spreading this across these vulnerable groups. We can go on to the next slide. The fourth and final consideration that I wanted to talk about today as a starting point is just looking at transit safety more broadly. So these aren't specific to human trafficking, but they are things that can help make the transportation system safer, and then in turn, safer for people from all crimes. So first and foremost, listening to and learning from rider groups. So listening to people that, experience this. Also, seeking alternative methods to increase police presence. So is there another way, if we can't afford, to have 7, fully trained police officers, what are some other methods that we can have to ensure security without having to have increased police presence? And then also altering the physical environment to deter crime. So we'll walk through each of those a little bit more. Let's see if we can go on to the next slide. Yes, so there's a couple of examples here, but just to talk a little bit deeper about each of those. I think it's very important that transit agencies provide opportunities for rider groups to provide feedback, voice their safety concerns, voice their suggestions. There's a lot of different ways to do this. We've seen virtual town halls, in-person town halls, customer surveys, focus groups, interviews. This way, agencies can hear from the riders themselves. What will make you feel more safe? What parts of the rider experience do you feel most at risk? And hearing directly from people who use these services every day and can provide better oversight. Also want to talk about, the alternative methods to police presence. So, there's definitely a role for police officers to play in transit safety. However, there might not need to be police officers in every situation. And so what are some other ways that we can ensure safety? So, this might be unarmed security, and maybe you can afford unarmed security in broader numbers than you can uniformed police officers. Maybe it's additional customer service agents that are trained in identifying situations of human trafficking that can handle the nonviolent offenses, such as, fare evasion or whatever that might be, where, a police officer is not needed. And then also I wanted to talk about the third item, which is altering the physical environment to deter crime. This is known as affecte, if you're familiar, or crime prevention through environmental design. And I actually learned about this many years ago, and it kind of just blew my mind. It was like a light bulb moment where, okay, if there's a lot of crime happening at this bus stop on this corner, what if we put a bright street light right there over top of this bus corner? It's a very small thing. It can be a small cost that makes a huge difference. Maybe there's some big bushes behind the train station where a lot of maybe drug activity or, illegal activity is happening. What if we cut down those bushes so there was clearer vision? So by altering the physical environment, you can actually provide more safety to that area. And so this is used in a lot of different areas of crime prevention, but specifically in the transit, adding lighting, adding, security cameras, cutting down bushes or, dark alleys, things like that, that can really make a difference in crime. So I want to talk through these state examples up here on the screen, and then I'll wrap up so we have a couple of minutes for questions. But the first one I wanted to share was that the LA Metro has 22 police officers and 40 social workers to conduct outreach to the homeless population and assist them in accessing services. So looking at these police officers paired with these social workers who are trained specifically on their Metro stations and on the the subways to really work with the homeless population, help them get services, and find the help that they need. As it relates to the SEPTED program, the U.S. Department of Transportation offers a SEPTED training program. It includes a lot of different aspects, but things such as assessments of risks and vulnerabilities of your site, best practices, some architectural design and space management concepts for how you can make your transit areas the safest. Again, environmental aims through space planning, behavioral concepts, crime prevention steps, and much more. And this is a free resource offered through the U.S. Department of Transportation. So I encourage folks to check that out too. You know, something as cheap as $100 of labor to cut down a tree or a bush or something like that can really make a difference. And studies have shown this over and over. I think it's a fascinating concept. So definitely recommend looking into that training through USDOT. Then if we can go on to the next slide. In conclusion, this was kind of the wrap up of our event. And, you know, bottom line is, what's the problem? The problem is that human trafficking often engages with the transportation industry. The lack of awareness and people knowing the signs is just causing this problem to continue. So really, what do we want to see? We want warning signs to become common knowledge, people to be able to identify this, and for there to be coordination of stakeholders and people to group together. We went through kind of who are some of those stakeholders, who needs to be at the table. You know, there are some challenges that states are facing and that states shared with us, such as, you know, lack of awareness of the issue, lack of awareness of potential solutions, lack of awareness of the connection to the transit system, and a lack of funding, the unintended consequences, and addressing all types of trafficking. So whether it be sex or labor trafficking. So kind of what are some short-term things? What are some things you could do in the next couple months to really take a look at that? You know, utilizing some existing resources within the state, spearheading the conversation, just setting up that first meeting, getting the right people at the table to just take that first step to talk about the issue. Maybe it's just looking at a systems map in your state of who are the right people to bring to the table, or what's the current landscape in my state? What are the existing policies, practices, things like that? And then also just communicating with the leaders in your state that this is an issue that, you know, we want to make sure is at the forefront of people's minds. And then long-term actions that were identified, you know, looking at identifying sustainable funding, building victim partnerships, developing a statewide task force, like we mentioned, enacting legislation, and then identifying the barriers for survivors. So these are some of the outcomes of the overall event. I hope that you will get the chance to read the report. I know Mary put it in the chat, and really think about what are those next steps that your state can take in addressing this issue. So again, I know we only have about 5 minutes for questions, but wanted to thank Kristen again for joining and sharing all of her expertise, and for CTA's partnership. And thank you all for joining today and making this a priority in your day. But I'll pass it to Mary, see if we had any questions, and Kristen and I would be happy to answer.
Thanks again so much, Sydney. That was an incredible, very thorough overview of the findings of the CSG report. So thank you so much for that. We did have one question come in through the chat, and so that 5 minutes should give us enough time to address that one at least. And this was a question about things, and this goes for an open question for Sydney or Kristen. What are some strategies that states or other transportation professionals can use in terms of addressing human trafficking for those with a language barrier?
Absolutely. Kristen, do you want to start? People might be tired of hearing my voice.
I'm certain not, Sydney. Well, all right. So I think that goes back to what Sydney said several times. Involve different groups in your community and across your state. And when we're talking about language barrier, let's kind of categorize this in two areas. One might be someone who speaks a different language than you do. It might be someone with a disability. So you would want to bring in an ESL group. If you know by looking at your data across your state, what groups are being represented larger in terms of language barriers, then find interpreters in that area. When it comes to people with disabilities, you want to look at maybe an independent, the Center for Independent Living, or you might want to talk to someone in the disability community that works with people who are hard of hearing and deaf. So, so I think it's just taking a very practical approach. If there is a need, there's probably someone in the community or in the state who has an expertise in that field.
And this is a great question. It made me think of an example actually that happened in Kentucky, in our largest city, Louisville, where there was a huge labor trafficking sting on a Chinese restaurant chain, where these people were unfortunately labor trafficked, and they were working crazy hours at all these different Chinese restaurants, and they all only spoke Mandarin. And so you have these, Kentucky police officers that are there trying to help them, and they're like, oh no, what do we do? And so they actually had to call in and bring in a translator. So, it was kind of an initial shock, and I think in a stressful situation, but once they got that translator in there to really help explain the situation, explain you're not in trouble, you're not going to be deported, and really helping them feel more comfortable. So I absolutely understand that that's a barrier. We're very lucky that there is federal legislation that, a victim cannot be deported just because they were a victim and they were found. There are a lot of protections for victims. And so that is another thing that we really need to get that out there. And that's something you want to say to victims up front. Because a lot of times that is a big fear of coming forward as a victim, or, a lot of people say, I'm not being trafficked, I'm here willingly. I love working 22 hours a day because of that fear. And so making sure that someone can share that with them in their language, whatever way they can best understand. So absolutely. Great point, Kristen, and great question. Maybe have time for one more question, super quick, Mary, if there's one.
Yeah, one more quick question that I see. Sydney, I'll punt this to you. In your opinion, based on the virtual learning seminar and everything, what is the best way that states can incorporate survivors' voices into addressing this issue?
Absolutely. I think that's a phenomenal question, and something that doesn't get spoken about enough. And, we always like to say nothing about us without us. That's kind of something I try to think of in all of my policy work. If I'm working with any population, I want someone with lived experience at that table that can speak. I think it's critical for their voices to be heard. And so working with, a lot of times the easiest way to get to that population is to work with those nonprofit agencies that are serving them. That would be, I would think, the most logical first step. And say, is there anyone that we would love to have someone with lived experience? I don't want to be making decisions on behalf of a population without them there. So definitely reaching out to your local nonprofits and engaging with them and having their voice at the table is incredibly important. So never want to underestimate and undervalue that importance. Kristen, anything to join there before we wrap up?
It's really that a lot of times we think of human trafficking only through the lens of sex trafficking, but we need to remember that it's sex trafficking, labor trafficking, domestic servitude. And so, just make sure that you keep that at the forefront. And I'm glad you brought up the labor trafficking example, Sydney.
Absolutely. That's a great point as well.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for your thoughtful responses to those questions. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Could we go to the last slide real quick? Perfect. That's all the time we have today for questions. Thank you again so much for taking time out of your busy week to join us. As mentioned at the beginning, the recorded presentation will be forwarded to you later this week or early next week. If you'd like to read the full contents of the report, again, the link is in the chat, or you can scan this QR code with your phone and it should take you right to the report. If you have any questions about what you've heard today or would like to connect further on this subject, please feel free to reach out to me or Sydney. Our contact information is up there on the slide. And thank you again so much. Have a great rest of your day and stay healthy.